Some of the research that I find so fascinating too is that something like 70% of people in America say that they quote unquote like Jesus, but only maybe less than 30% say that they like his followers. But a lot of times what people have in mind about this Jesus they like isn't even the Jesus of the Bible.
Well, hello, everyone. I just got to talk to a friend and colleague, Natasha Crain. Many of you probably are familiar with her writing, her books. Her most recent one, When Culture Hates You. That was the focus of our conversation. But Natasha's a prolific writer, 5 books at this point. She's launched a podcast, not so recently, but it's starting really to take off, the Natasha Crain podcast. So be sure to check that out. And today we just talk about what is the Christian's obligation to engage in the common good? What even is the common good and how are we to pursue it? Is it something that we're just to leave to atheists to wrestle with and Christians should stay away from things like politics? Or if not, what is the proper way to engage in pursuing the common good? The discussion is framed, I think, very helpfully with the idea that Jesus said the world's going to hate us. That's unavoidable. And they're going to hate us because we pursue righteousness and live righteously. And I think it was a really helpful way to frame this issue because a lot of times Christians think we need to stay away from these issues so the world will like us and we can focus on the gospel. Well, if that's the goal, that's a fool's goal, because if we're living righteously, the world will hate us because men love the darkness because they can do whatever they want and they hate the light. So what does it mean to be the children of the light in a culture that doesn't share your values? How do you live out those values and even pursue those values for others for their good through political means? That's a bit of our conversation. We get sidetracked along the way, but all good conversations should take excursions or have a tangent. So hope you stick around for the hour conversation. I had a great time and I think you'll enjoy it too. Natasha, it is really good to see you. It's funny. I think the first time we met was at a conference in New Jersey, which is where I'm from. But ever since then, and maybe was that 10 years ago? I don't know. We're not that old, so it probably wasn't 10 years ago. But I can't keep straight that you don't live in New Jersey. It's so funny. I always have to reorient myself that you live in the exact opposite direction. So anyhow, it was really good.
That's so funny. I forgot about that. Like if you had asked me, how did we meet? I would not have remembered that. But now that you say that, you're right. That is how we met. That's very funny. Yes, I'm in Southern California.
Most people forget for various reasons the first time we met. They like to just block that out of their
It's
their
not
mind.
personal.
So, well, okay, I'll believe you on that. But since that time, man, you have just been at it, been busy, written 5 books, I think, over the course of that period of time. And I'm really curious because I don't know the answer to this. Why did you get into writing? Has this been something that for years it's kind of like you've always been a writer and you just hit it, or you discovered this later in life? How did you get into this? Why did you get into this? What's your experience been like?
Yeah, I didn't set out to be a writer. I definitely did not set out to be a speaker or anything like that. I'm an introvert, and so writing would be more comfortable for me, but it wasn't something that I was seeking to do. So basically all this happened because back in 2011, I decided to start a blog. Again, not because I wanted to be a writer, just because I was kind of looking for an outlet. I had 3 kids who were 3 and under at the time. And I just kind of wanted something that I could do to, share with others about what was going on in terms of parenting and get to know other bloggers.
3 and under? How in the world
Yes.
did you think you should start writing then?
Well, it's one of those things where you start getting into that routine, and it can feel a little bit mundane at that age, right? Because when you have you've got the diapers and you're picking up Cheerios and all those kinds of things that you're doing. And I just kind of wanted an outlet, something on the side of that. And so everyone was starting a blog in 2011. And I just thought, well, that's something I can do too. And they were kind of blog communities. You could get to know other parents. So it was a little bit of an opportunity to form community online. So I started this blog called Christian Mom Thoughts. I didn't think anything about how I was naming it. Obviously, that's the worst title of a blog in the history of blogs. Christian Mom Thoughts. Who cares, right? But that's what it was. I started writing about what we were doing with our very little kids to teach them about Jesus and who he was, and really didn't think much of it. But over time, my blog grew. People were sharing my blog posts. They liked what I was writing. And as things went out on social media, of course, that draws other people to your blog. And I started getting skeptics of Christianity who would come to the site, and they would leave comments like, "You're just indoctrinating your kids. Don't you know there's no evidence that God exists? The Bible's filled with errors and contradictions. There's no evidence that Jesus even existed as a person in history." I mean, I just got all these kinds of challenges. I wasn't looking for this at all, obviously. And I had been a lifelong Christian, grew up in the church, grew up in a Christian home, but still had never really encountered these kinds of objections. No one had brought those kinds of questions into my life before, so I certainly didn't know the answers. And it actually didn't make me question Christianity, really. It wasn't a story of like, oh my gosh, and then I realized I don't know why I believe this. It was more like, hey, my kids are growing up in a totally different world than the one in which I grew up. And so I need to actually get answers to these things. And so that's when I discovered apologetics, how you make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity. And I just went off into an intense reading journey where I was really just trying to learn everything that I could. And in that process, I would take what I was learning and then turn around on my blog and say, hey, parents, these are the kinds of things that your kids are going to hear today. You need to know how to answer them. And here's what I've learned. And so over time, the blog exploded from there as other parents were like, yeah, I don't know how to answer that either, but I need to know how. And eventually a publisher actually reached out to me and said, hey, what if you took maybe 40 of these questions that you're aware of that skeptics put out there and just write easy to understand answers for Christian parents? And that became my first book, called Keeping Your Kids on God's Side. And so I ended up writing 3 books of apologetics for parents. And then in 2020, I kind of made a shift because when we saw all these cultural upheavals that were happening, I realized, man, there's a lot we need to talk about in terms of how do you more clearly have a biblical worldview in the midst of a secular culture. So I went out on a limb for the first time and started writing blog posts about those issues, not just parenting. And those were some of my biggest blog posts ever. That led to me writing Faithfully Different, my last book, and now When Culture Hates You. So that's kind of a long answer to your question, but no, I didn't set out to do anything that I'm doing right now. It was kind of an interesting genesis of all of that.
So which of those has been your favorite? And they, for different reasons, I'm sure you might, just how would you answer that? What's your favorite of the 5 that you've written?
To write, to the favorite one to write or to tell people about?
pick however you want to answer it.
I think maybe this is just a recency bias, but I guess that my most recent one, When Culture Hates You, might have been my favorite one to write, not because it was the easiest, it was the hardest book to write, I think, but because it came from such a deep well of passion, having seen a lot of the bad thinking that Christians have about public influence and politics and seeking the common good, especially in the last years, we saw the election. It just gave me this sense of, man, this has to be written. Somebody's got to write about this, because all the other books that seem to have been written around this topic were coming from a different perspective, a very left of center kind of perspective for Christians. And I just thought we need to do something different. So in terms of the sense of urgency, I would definitely say that. But
so what made it the hardest book? Was it because of just the political environment that you were writing it in, the topics that you cover at the end of the book, or something else?
Yeah, I'd say the darkness of it, because the first half of the book kind of sets up all the big picture issues and sets some, theological background, some historical background, the civic background of our country. But in the last half of the book, I get into very specific issues. And my goal is not to just say, hey, here's the biblical view on these issues and we need to hold to it. Of course, that's true. And I talk about that. But my goal was actually to address why the culture hates us on those issues. So not just here's what we need to understand about abortion, but why do people actually hate us for what we believe about abortion and the sanctity of life? Where does that hatred stem from? And so in order to do that, I had to really get into the mindset of the culture on these issues like transgenderism and the sexual liberation of children and abortion and even Christian nationalism that I talk about in the book. And in doing so, you really realize that this culture is in deep rebellion against the creator. And it's hard to wrap your head around a lot of the things that you see out there when you're reading everything from a very secular, ungodly perspective. So it did feel very dark by the end of the book that I had to immerse myself in that. But it did make me also appreciate just how great of a need there is for us to be God's light today.
So, why more than just understanding an issue like abortion or Christian nationalism? Why do you think it's so important for Christians to understand why we're hated on these issues or the stance that we take on them?
I think we can engage better with culture, number one, because when you understand where somebody else is coming from, then you're better able to speak to their specific objections. And so I give a lot of examples of that in the book to help people to formulate responses in that way. But the other part of this that I think is really important is that it helps us to reset our expectations. Too many Christians today, I think, have an expectation that if we do everything right as a Christian, people are going to like us. They're going to think that we're nice and we're just great people who are out there serving the homeless and doing good things for people. We have this expectation that in reality, if you look at scripture, is a false expectation. And sometimes people will say, well, when culture hates you, that's such a strong word. It's kind of divisive to suggest that the culture hates us. Maybe they don't hate us. Well, let's look at what Jesus says. 2,000 years ago, Jesus told his disciples before they were going out on mission, if the world hates you, there's the word, hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. And here's the key point. If the world now I'm gonna forget that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. See, that's a really important verse to understand because it gives us an explanation. Jesus didn't just say, hey, the world might hate you when you go out there. It hated me. That's just how it's going to go. He actually told us why. And that's so important to understand. He said, if you were of the world would love you as its own. So what does it mean to be of the world? It means to be under the governing rule of Satan. Quite literally in scripture, we see this comparison throughout where people are either under the rule of Satan or under the rule of God. You are children of God or children of Satan. You are a slave to sin, a slave to righteousness. And so as scripture tells us, people who are practicing righteousness are going to be hated by those who are not, who are going their own way. They're going according to the desires of the flesh, the will of Satan himself. So we're going to be hated. And when we understand that's the nature of what we're seeing, the hostility in this culture. It's not just an intellectual debate like, oh, I think you're wrong, pro-lifer. I think that this is how you should see it. But it's an actual moral hostility where people say, oh, you're just horrible and toxic and harmful and oppressive. That goes right back to why Jesus said the world would hate us, because people who are practicing righteousness will be hated. So it's important to understand the nature of the hostility that we see so that we can have the right expectations, understand why these are ultimately issues of righteousness. And then when people do hate you, yes, make sure it's not because you were a jerk in the way you delivered something or you're not talking with people in a gracious way. But at the same time, understand even when you do everything really well, according to what the Bible would tell you, the truth and love, they're going to hate you for it. Make sure we understand
Yeah.
why.
I thought that was a very helpful way to frame it in your book and your writing, by the way. You have this really good ability of just getting straight to the point and bringing clarity on issues that can be foggy. And on this topic in particular, when you're going to talk about things like the intersection of politics and faith, and then getting into these issues, these tend to be murky, and it's hard to see clearly. But I think your writing, it's just, that's your gift. You just get right to it, straight to it. And that's not to say it's boring or simple or like just plain writing. It's just really, it's like shining a flashlight on some of these issues. So that's really helpful. And I think framing this, this topic, when culture hates you, then moving into these topics, framing it from an issue of righteousness, I think is very helpful. So real quick, do you think this notion, Jesus, most Christians would know. Yeah, I remember that verse. Jesus said that. Yeah, Jesus said the world's going to hate you. You think Christians really believe that or take it seriously? Or it's kind of like, yeah, but I don't know, Jesus. They probably only hate us if. Do you think the church really takes that verse seriously in the sense that they believe Jesus on that?
I think there's a lot that the church and that in a broad sense does not believe Jesus about. The statistics out there that 65% of people in America identify as a Christian, but only about 4% have what we would consider to be a biblical worldview. If you actually ask people what they believe, that, do your beliefs line up with the truth of what scripture teaches? And according to that research from Arizona Christian University's Cultural Research Center, the answer is only 4% of people have that worldview. So when you look at it from that perspective, in some sense, the vast majority of the church does not believe Jesus's words on a lot of things, and that would include this. And there's also a problem with biblical literacy in the church, that people don't really know what the Bible teaches. And so I think that those who don't know the Bible, don't see the Bible as their authority for one reason or another, of course, they're not going to understand why Jesus would say that.
What do you
Because
think some of those reasons are? What do you attribute to this decline of biblical literacy, such a small percentage of people having a biblical worldview? What's your sense about why it is the way that it is?
Well, I think in some sense the church has not discipled people well in these areas, that people get to church, and this is not all churches, but I think that many churches, it's just come to church on Sunday and you hear the pastor, and there's not this emphasis on getting back to the Bible yourself. And that same research shows that many pastors do not have a biblical worldview also. So if you don't have a pastor with a biblical worldview, they're not going to be training their people on having a biblical worldview either. And so we end up with people having all kinds of bad ideas of Jesus. Some of the research that I find so fascinating too is that something like 70% of people in America say that they quote unquote like Jesus, but only maybe less than 30% say that they like his followers. But a lot of times what people have in mind about this Jesus they like isn't even the Jesus of the Bible. Right? So they like a Jesus of their own making. They're not even liking Jesus for who he is. And when they're thinking of what they don't like about his followers, usually they're thinking about things that his followers say that are consistent with what the real Jesus said. So they're thinking about how they don't like his followers because they advocate for pro-life views, or because they advocate for a biblical view of gender and sexuality. So they say, I don't like his followers because they have these harmful, hurtful beliefs. But Jesus, he's just this nice guy, right? He's a great moral example. He did a lot of good stuff. We love Jesus. So it's just so interesting to me that people like Jesus. They don't like his followers, but usually what they don't like about his followers is what's true of Jesus.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything to this also where, to that point of people liking Jesus but not his followers, do you think maybe one of the problems is that Christians in this isolated world, we don't know that many non-believers, or even if know, intimately know, not know of, but know in a meaningful way. Cause it's kind of like, there's this narrative out there about Christians, or the sound bites and the slander that exists towards us. And it's kind of like, shouldn't our neighbors though, shouldn't that fall on deaf ears? Cause shouldn't the neighbor, when they're hearing some trope or some just common narrative about Christians and social media, whatever, shouldn't they go, well, never met Natasha. They've never met my neighbor, Mike. I don't know what Christians they're talking about, but they're not talking about the ones I know. Do you think part of the problem is Christians, we just aren't in meaningful relationships with non-believers, or do you think maybe that I'm just totally off base with that kind of thought?
Well, I definitely, that's a really interesting question. I definitely think that there's something to that because, we can, especially when you look around, if you're passionate about your faith and you look about the direction of society and you start to form more silos within, your church community. And I know I can be guilty of this as well. It's something that I actually think about, do I get out there enough with non-Christians? And I think that a lot of times that answer is no in my personal life. Obviously on my online and presence in my ministry, that way I do. But, what about my personal life? So it's a really good and convicting question, because we should be out there forming meaningful relationships with non-believers. And yet, I think because of what we already talked about with what Jesus warned, that the world would hate us, there is still always going to be this sense from non-believers that when you talk about these issues, when you put forth your views, people will still hate Christians in some sense. It doesn't mean they're going to hate us for everything we do all the time. So, if you're just having a potluck dinner with your non-Christian neighbors and you're not talking about some of these specifics on your views and how they influence society, they're not going to hate you for that. right? I talk about in the book, like if you're serving food to the homeless, probably no one's going to hate you for that. But when you hold these views that go contrary to the popular moral consensus and you start advocating for society to be influenced by those views, when you want to shape society according to biblical values, that's when people start hating you. So I think that it's a both. It's a both and, right? Yes, we need more meaningful relationships so that we don't just fall prey to that narrative. At the same time, because we know what Jesus warned of, there will still be plenty of hatred for people who are advocating for righteousness.
Yeah, I think that's good. I do think, right. And it's my own, you know, conviction that I feel in my own life. I mean, I got 5 kids, one with special needs. All of the, well, three of the, all of them are in sports. One does piano. We're involved in church, midweek service. I mean, travel for speaking. It's like, where is the margin for this? But knowing that those in my community need to know true followers of Jesus, my family, we've got to find ways to prioritize this, because it's a lot harder to hate somebody when you know them. And getting back to the Jesus said they're still going to hate you point, we'll come back to that in a second. But real quick story, I had this in a Bible study years ago. An older man opens up and just gets real serious and honest. And he was confessing. He wasn't bragging. He wasn't making a joke. He goes, guys, I just got to tell you, I hate Democrats. I truly hate them. And everybody was real quick, and because at least where I'm at, people were real quick to amen that kind of thing. And he was like, no, I'm serious. I hate him and I don't like it about me. And I go, well, wait a minute. And I'm not saying the real name here, but I go, what about your friend Bob? And he goes, well, what about Bob? I go, well, you clearly don't hate him and he's a Democrat. He goes, oh, not Democrats like Bob. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, if you were to care, you couldn't make a more pure Democrat than Bob. But why don't you hate him? It was like, well, and then the point was obvious that people are more than simply a position that they hold. And when you get to know a person, it's not as easy to hate him. It doesn't preclude that hatred, but it doesn't make it as easy. And so in this moment, this hostility and cultural divide, as the culture wars still rage, the church has to prioritize seeking out meaningful relationships. But the way you start the book is really important, though, because we still have to have our expectations set appropriately. If we truly are living a righteous life, we're going to be hated for it, because men love the darkness and they hate those that bring light to that darkness. And so I think that holding these things in tension is just important for followers of Jesus to move forward, living righteous lives, letting that righteousness be seen by others. So as Jesus said, they will see those good works, as you point out in your book, and praise the Father in heaven. That will be one of the outcomes of us living a publicly righteous life. The other side, though, is there's still going to be some that hate us and despise us for our righteousness.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point about the relationships, because it's something I've kind of been thinking about lately, in as far as it goes with my kids, even because I feel like they've kind of lived in a Christian bubble to a degree in terms of the people they know, because they've either been homeschooled or they have gone to Christian private school their whole lives. Now, that doesn't mean that all the kids that they go to school with clearly are committed Christians, because that's not the case either. So it's not like they've only been exposed to committed Christians in any sense of that. But it's also different than being out there in the world and experiencing what life is like outside of that. And I've worked really hard, given what I do and my emphasis on apologetics, to not keep them in any kind of bubble with respect to ideas. So by any stretch of the imagination, they're not in that bubble, because I have presented them with all of these challenges and all of these ideas over time. But to actually be in relationship with people who have no connection to Christianity, even through a school setting or a church setting, I think that that's something that we could have just done much better. And we have 3 teenagers, and so it's not that it's over that we can't do that still. It's just harder to do sometimes, depending on what kind of schools your kids go to and that kind of thing. But your point is so true, I think.
Well, it's one of the biggest questions we get asked, or I get asked in our organization, our team of speakers get asked, is like, how do you balance this with kids? When's too soon to introduce them to ideas? how much bubble wrap is too much bubble wrap, and it's a hard one, right? It's a hard one to answer. I mean, again, I've got 5 kids, and I think innocence and protecting them from the brokenness in this world is a gift. And I do think my parents, it's one of the gifts of my childhood, is I do think I was protected from a lot of the brokenness. My parents would say they didn't do it right. And when I talk positively and praise them for their efforts, they're like, we clearly have a different memory of what our home was like growing up. But I'm like, I think they did a great job and protected us from the brokenness. Of course, it also led to, they would say, mistakes they made, like forbidding us from watching He-Man when we were growing up, or when the new Batman came out with Michael Keaton and Jack Nicklaus. I couldn't see it. And you know why I couldn't go see it? Because it was PG-13. And you know how old I was? I was 12. And so just like, this kind of letter of the law, but, mistakes
but
like
parenting
that.
is such, I mean, I preach to the choir here. You have 5 kids, I have 3, but like it's an art. It's not a science, right? I mean, it's
No.
so hard to know.
And it's like splatter paint art. Let's be honest.
Yeah, and you're like, I'm trying for consistency because I want my kids to see consistency in this or that. But then there are some things where it's like, well, that's not consistent, right? And then you just feel like, oh, they're going to think that I'm a hypocrite about this. And it's especially when they get to be teens. Consistency, I thought, was way easier when the kids were younger.
Oh, forget about it. And my kids point this out. My oldest daughter, who's turning 16 this month, she says that she and Aaron got the good parents. And the younger 3 have gotten the bad parents. And by that, what she means is this lack of consistency and anything goes with the younger ones. And it's, of course, being a bit dramatic, but anyway.
I hear you. It's very difficult to maintain that. I look back, I know it was hard when you have little kids because it's just tiring physically, and it's not an easy job. But in a major sense, it's way easier than when the kids get to be teenagers. It's hard to navigate. It really is.
It is. Well, and you said you might have done it better if you could do it over again, which of course we all say that. I think introducing them to ideas early is really important. And that's a way, I think, for Christian parents to seek out some good balance here of, I don't want to bubble wrap them so much that they're completely oblivious to what's going on in the world, but to the degree that I can, I don't want the darkness and the brokenness to affect them. So one way you can do that is through you choose kind of when and how to expose them to ideas and not necessarily the consequences of these ideas. And so some of the ways that in the consequences of the ideas is what you might experience in the world from somebody, following those ideas. And one of the ways we would do it is I would ask questions, like when it comes to something like abortion. I would say like, hey, I'm getting ready to go with my friend Scott Klusendorf to England, and we're going to go speak on abortion. Have you heard that word before? And if they say no, it's kind of like, well, I probably can just leave it alone for right now, or just leave it there and just see it. Because sometimes, like, I remember this one time with my oldest daughter, she went no, and I was like, okay. And then like 5 minutes later, so what does that word mean? And then you can have an age appropriate conversation. So that's one way where it's like, for me, it's like, I'm always wondering, like, I don't want to introduce a concept to them too soon, but I also don't want to be too late and let their impressionable mind being shaped by these ideas from people that I don't want them to be shaped by. So one of the ways I would kind of prize, I would often just ask, like, have you heard that word before? And most often it was no. And then often it would be followed up by, what does that mean? And then some kind of age appropriate answer that begins to frame an issue for them. And one of the other things that I did too, which was passed on to me from Josh McDowell, I thought this was really helpful advice when it comes to sexual issues. He said, you're never going to be able to prevent them from experiencing that darkness. Those ideas are going to find them. And like when it comes to something like pornography, it's going to find them. So you need to prepare them for the first time they experience that brokenness. And the way you do it is you talk about the goodness of sexuality as early and as often as you can. And I think you draw out a point similar to this when it comes to like politics. The church always makes the mistake of, don't do it that way, don't do it that way, don't do it that way. That's the pitfall, that's the pitfall, that's the pitfall, but not talking about the appropriate way you can be seeking the good of your neighbor through political avenues. Christians do this with sexuality all the time. It's always here's the guardrail, here's the don't do, here's the don't touch. But so I was like, man, this is good advice. So from a very early age, me and my wife Terry, we would, point out differences between like older brother, younger sister, and be like, isn't it cool that God made us this way? And then when questions would come, it's always in the, yeah, and isn't it cool that? And so to frame something like sexuality in a beautiful way as a part of God's good design was one way we, again, started to bring some awareness to these issues. Then when it comes to the dark side of it, we would ask some questions to see what they've been exposed to. And that's kind of how we've done it over time. And not to say that we did it perfect or right, but that's one of the ways we tried to, find some balance between preparing them for the brokenness, but also as their children, protecting them from it so that they can, well, if you don't have to experience brokenness, why should you? And so to some degree, parents should be protecting their parents in that way. So anyways.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I would just say like, I do something similar, and my husband and I will, compare the worldviews. Like, I think this is one of the most important things that we can do. It's not just like you're saying, it's not just don't do this because the Bible is this rule book. And let me look up this verse and show you, what it says right here, because that doesn't give kids an understanding of how Christianity is a lens through which we see everything. It is what aligns with reality. I grew up in a Christian home, and I had no sense of that by the time that I left home. I grew up in the church, spent hundreds of hours there. I knew, the basics of Christianity, obviously, but it was just kind of like a suitcase of beliefs that I would take alongside of me to college, because I didn't understand that this was a whole picture of reality. So I think that when you take the time to compare the worldviews like that, and to say, not just don't do this, but, here's God's design for family. Here's God's design for sex and for marriage and for gender. And this is why we believe in the sanctity of life. It's presenting them with a whole way of seeing reality, the right way of seeing reality. And so I think it's so much better to help kids view things from that perspective than just using the Bible as a lookup. There's so many tools like that. I mean, we're way off topic right now, but I just gotta say there's so many tools like that. Where, for young kids, you see them advertised all the time. And it's like, okay, if we're struggling with anger, we're going to look up anger in this verse, and if we need, there's nothing wrong with that in the sense that, yeah, of course we want to learn to go back to God's word. We want to teach kids to go back to the Bible. But if we're not framing that in a broader sense of, well, who is God? What is his character? Why does it matter? Why does anger matter in the first place? Why did Jesus get angry? What's the difference between his anger and our anger? Sometimes when we don't give this broader theological understanding, it does just become like, oh, here's a wheel and you can turn it to the verse depending on what you need on a given day. And so I've always really kind of hated those types of things because it misses the bigger picture in such a way.
Well, and here's the segue to back on topic. So this notion of design or telos, the purpose of a thing, has to be recaptured in Christian teaching as opposed to just focusing on the law or the rule. So here's the segue back, right? You talk early on in the book about the notion of the common good. I think defining good is one of the biggest challenges that we have right now in present Western society. Not to get too long-winded and risk going off topic again, but for thousands of years, the Western world was guided by a singular ethical framework. Part of it was a notion of telos, that things have intrinsic meaning and purpose. And in understanding that, you now basically have a compass for right and wrong. Because if you don't understand a thing's purpose, words like good have no meaning. Like, this cup, we understand what the intrinsic purpose of a cup is, which allows us to say things like, hey, that's a good cup. And it means something more than just fulfilling some subjective arbitrary preference of mine. No, we know cups have a purpose, and when they fulfill that purpose, it gives context for the word good. For thousands of years, this goes back to the Greek philosophers, carried on through when Christianity spread throughout Europe and Western society turned into what it is now. This notion of intrinsic purposes carried us forward. That, of course, was destroyed and rejected during the Enlightenment. And now we live in a period of history where we have this kind of this fragmented ethical heritage, where we have some of it goes back to this classical ethic with notions of telos. And then there is, in the Enlightenment, you have the emergence of secular kind of transcendent ethics, which still trying to find something objective and beyond human beings to justify ethics, even though we don't believe in telos anymore. We don't believe in God. And then you have the rise of Nietzsche and this subjectivism. And so we live in this really morally fragmented time. So all that to say, when we're talking about moral issues and pursuing a common good, what the word good even means is really challenging. So what do you have to say to that? And how do we overcome that challenge in establishing a common good? Because when it comes to when cultural hates you, this is the thing that we're fighting over, and what we're hated over is our differing views on what is this common good.
Yeah, that was a great summary of kind of the history of
Wasn't I was
how we got there.
hoping you were going to praise me for that
I am
summary and
praising you. That
transition
was an
back.
excellent brief
That was
overview. I
pretty
love it.
clever.
No, but I mean, you're spot on. It really does come down to that. The second chapter in the book is about what is the common good. And ultimately, when we talk about culture wars and the debates that are going on in society, they're over, well, what is good for society? You know, you don't overwhelmingly have one group of people who are saying, well, we're advocating for what we believe is good, and another group saying, well, we're advocating for what we think is bad for society. You know, that you don't see that. Everyone's advocating for what they think is good. The question is, what is actually good? And so, what I talk about in that chapter is the fact that good is ultimately just how you define that is the tip of a worldview iceberg. It is inherently connected to how someone sees all of reality. It's not an easy thing to come back and define for all, because everyone in our country is going to have a different worldview that they're coming from. So from a, let's say that you're coming from a purely naturalistic perspective. There is no God. The world is just this material place. There is no moral law because there is no moral lawgiver. Well, in that kind of case, if you're being consistent, logically consistent with your worldview, then what you're advocating for in society is going to be just according to your own definition of good. And you're going to have to recognize that everyone's just competing on their own subjective definitions of that. And the best you can do is convince enough people to give you the power in order to impose your idea of good on everybody else. So most people in our society aren't actually atheists. Only about 10% of people, according to the research, would say that they don't believe in any kind of God or higher power. But what you do have overwhelmingly in our society is what I would call functional deists. So they believe in God, some kind of higher power, but not necessarily the God of the Bible. They're not looking to the Bible and saying, oh, well, the God who created everything actually revealed himself in scripture. So they believe in a God that they like, a God of their own making, kind of like the Jesus that we were talking about earlier. So they believe overwhelmingly that he's all knowing and all loving and all powerful, all the things that we like to believe, but they don't believe he has revealed himself in any way where we can know important things like who he is and who we are and what's required of us and our moral standards and so on. So if this is how, according to the research, the vast majority of people in America think, then their idea of good is ultimately just going to come back to everyone's subjective opinion, because they have no objective basis for saying, well, this is what is actually good because the creator told us so. So ultimately, they're in the same place as someone who doesn't believe in God at all. Whether there is no good in existence because that God doesn't exist, and therefore we can't call anything good in the first place, or there may be some idea of good, but we don't know it because the God who does exist didn't reveal it, you can't define good in an objective sense for all of society. But as Christians, we have to be more clear than that. We have to understand that while there are going to be competing ideas of good in our country, that doesn't have any sense of meaning that, oh, well, we have to step back because everyone has different ideas. Well, there is only one good. People can have different opinions about the meaning of good. But as Christians, we believe that God has revealed himself in scripture, and therefore we know, according to his objective standards, what is truly good. So we can say what is going to be for the common good on things like abortion or on gender policies or on issues of marriage and the family and sexuality. All of those things we can take from our inferences on what the Bible is teaching. And so we know what is good. We have a confident, objective basis for determining that. And therefore, when we're advocating for that, we need to not just see it as one idea of good we're putting forth in society. We need to see that as, well, we understand what's good because God has told us, and therefore we want to advocate for what is righteous in society. It's for the good of others, whether or not they think that's good for themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to engage on this issue for reasons that go beyond the issues themselves. And here's a case in point. When we start to, engage an issue like abortion or the LGBTQ plus issues or any contentious political issue, I think your point's it's really good. We're contending with someone else who has a view of what is good, right? There's just not a ton of villains in society that are doing evil for evil's sake, right? They're pursuing what they think is good. And a really important question to ask in relationships when you come into conflict here is, how do you define good? And this is where this turns into gospel conversations, right? And so we often live in this either you pursue the gospel or you pursue politics. And it's like, no, that's too simplistic and ignorant of a view. Often in pursuing the common good with your neighbor, you lead to questions like, what is good in the first place? Because are you really operating under the assumption that what you're pursuing for other people is just your subjective preferences that you want to force on other people? And they would say, well, no. Okay, so if not, then what are you appealing to? You're appealing to some notion of good that goes beyond us. Well, what does it go beyond to? Something else arbitrary? What Christians believe is it goes to the holy God in whom all goodness is rooted. And so this is like how quickly a conversation about abortion turns into a kind of gospel conversation and can really lead to a heck of a lot of good, the good of someone's soul, but also the good of your unborn neighbor. So yeah, I think chapter 2 in your book, getting right to what's at issue here, is a fight over the common good. And nested within that is the worldview beliefs and assumptions you have about the nature of reality. And is good simply the result of subjective preferences being forced on others, or are things good connected to something transcendent? If so, what is that transcendent thing? And this is where the conversation has to happen. And Christians, I think we got to do a better job, at least in relational settings, about backing up and go, whoa, 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 whoa. Before we get too far into this fight, what is even the word good mean? How do we define good? Where does goodness come from? Is it just arbitrary preferences, or is it something more? If it is the something more, what is the something more? And how do we know that? And Christians, we have a lot of good answers to it, what you had talked about. I mean, so many good answers for this, and the kind of rich, fruitful conversations that are this interwoven gospel and politic, right? And that's just the way that it's going to be, and so much good can come from this. What do you think? If we're on the same page here, how do we pursue that though? Okay, right. What are some practical ways to begin pursuing these conversations about what is the common good? But then moving into politics, where does this end? Are we only to pursue these relationally? Can we pursue the common good politically? And how do we do this the right way?
Well, there are a lot of questions embedded in that. So let's start with the one about politics.
Yeah,
How does this relate to the common good? I think one of the reasons that Christians are not prepared to have the conversations that you're saying we should have, and that I completely agree with, is because, like I said earlier, the church is not discipling people in these ways. I've never seen a church really get into these topics of like, hey, let's talk about the nature of good and why does that matter, and how does it depend on a worldview, and what about your neighbor? They're saying that this other view over here, that this is good, that if you allow minors to transition into another gender, that you're helping them to be free and you're making them happy, and they say that that's good. Why is that not good from a Christian perspective? The reason that so many churches are not even touching this is because they think it's political. And without even stopping to identify, well, what is politics and what would the Bible even tell us about that? They've kind of accepted this mantra of like, well, Christians shouldn't be political. And I really hope that that's one of the key takeaways that people will have from my book, is a better understanding of what it looks like to advocate politically for the common good. The common good is not always a political issue, but it often is. And so we have to have a good understanding of that. So what I always
and today everything is political, which is another conversation.
Well,
of
right,
course,
and
whether
the reason
everything should be political, but the reality is everything literally is political these days.
And that's because of the definition of political. So when you actually get back to, well, what is politics? What does that mean? What does it mean to be political? Politics is the way that people living in communities together make decisions about how they're living together. That's what politics is. I mean, when you strip away the baggage, that's what we're talking about. So, we as Christians live in a society with other people, and we live in a constitutional republic in this particular country. And therefore, there's a certain way that we have been given the right to advocate for making decisions about how we're going to live together. Should we as Christians be involved in having a say in that? Well, of course. Of course, we have the right to do that in our country as much as anyone else does. Now, it's possible that the Bible would say, oh, but you should not exercise that kind of right. Theoretically, we might have a conflict between what scripture says and what we have a right to do in society, but that's not the case. When we go back to see what scripture says about politics, there are a lot of things that we can conclude from scripture, and I talk about some of those in the book. But in Romans 13, quite directly, it talks about the purpose of government and as civil rulers to promote the good and restrain the evil. I mean, that's the simplest way to remember it. So we as Christians, if we know that other people have wrong ideas about good and evil, they're literally calling good evil and evil good, as it says in Isaiah. If we know that this is going to be a thing in the world, and we actually have the right definition of good and evil according to God's standards, and that's the purpose of government, to promote the truly good and restrain the truly evil, doesn't it go without saying that we need to be advocating for righteous government in that way? Of course it does. Of course it does. But then churches say, well, these are political issues. People have different views. I don't care if people have different views. If they don't have the biblical view, if they don't have God's view, it's the wrong view, and we need to correct that. And we need to help people to understand how to advocate for the good, both at a societal level and in individual conversations with people. So those are two different kinds of things. One is a public advocacy question, and then the other is, well, when you're engaging with individual people, then how do you do that? And I just feel like the church doesn't want to touch a lot of these issues. And I hate to paint the broad brush and say the church, because the church gets a bad rap in a lot of cases. There are plenty of pastors too who are engaging in these things, but overwhelmingly, the church doesn't touch these things. And so people aren't prepared to have the conversations that we're talking about. I hope that a lot of people, even if their church doesn't want to have a book study around a quote unquote political book, something that touches on politics like mine, I hope that a lot of lay people will say, hey, I want to do a study around this book. I want to educate more Christians about these ideas so that people do start thinking better about them. Because it's either going to come from the top down, pastors who already understand the importance of this, or it's going to come from the bottom up, people within the church who are saying, hey, I want to do a study, in the fall talking about these issues and getting Christians more understanding of how to engage.
Yeah. I have a hard time understanding that it's political. We can't touch it. I really do. And I pastored for 11 years. So in a lived sense, I get it. I mean, I understand the pressure, but from a biblical worldview sense, I don't get it. I mean, we're called to love our neighbor as ourself. There's nothing in the Bible that precludes pursuing political means to do that. Of course, the Bible doesn't talk about it a ton, but as you point out in the book, you got to consider the first century political environment where the opportunity, the system of government that we live in wasn't almost even imagined at the time, really. And people will go, well, the Greeks had a democracy. Yeah, okay, that's fine. We're not a true democracy. We're a representative democracy. The system of government we have is way better.
Well, you can look at the old, I was just to say, like along those lines, you can look at the Old Testament too. The entire Old Testament is God calling out nations for being unjust, for example. He's calling out the injustice, and he's calling nations to righteousness and how they function. He cares about the moral health of society. It could not be more clear when you look at how he relates to these nations.
God's expectation for government and nations in the Old Testament, that why would he call them unjust unless there was expectation that nations and in their governance should be just? And what I was about to say was, Christians, we forget the fundamental calling of all human beings is to be an image bearer that has subdominion and is called to rule and bring order to this world. And that inevitably leads to creating systems of order. One of those simply would be government. And probably the most read blog article I ever wrote was sarcastically titled, "No, you're right. We should just let atheists run the country." And it's like, where did that stupid idea come from? Why do Christians not think that bringing a ordered system of government that recognizes the inherent dignity of all people who are made in the image of God and creating rules that allow us to live out this inherently meaningful life, why is that an endeavor that Christians should be like, no, keep our hands off? No, it's like we should certainly, to the degree that we can, in the time in history and the place in which the Lord has appointed us to be, seek the good of our neighbor through these means. And I just don't get it. And often, if I'm just going to be truthful, those pastors that say, I'm not going to touch that, it's political. It's not because it's political. It's because it's politically unpopular. Thank you. Because there's a number of political issues that they have no issue contending for or being an advocate of. It's only the hard case ones or the unpopular ones. So I'm with you in that. My hope is that through a book like yours, so many Christians get a proper vision of how do I pursue this common good. It's not going to be an easy quest because we're going to be hated for our position because we're pursuing righteousness, but the Lord's ways are not arbitrary. They're designed for human flourishing. The Creator knows best how his creation ought to be. And when we fall in line with his ways, it goes well for us. And so we should seek that for our neighbors because of love. And there's surely bad ways we've done that in the past and poor ways we can continue to do it. But you would think that the children of light would figure out how to do it the right way. And my hope is that the Lord uses your book and other works to that end. Maybe in, landing this plane a little bit and not just going through every issue that you cover in the back of your book. So maybe the question is why did you land on those issues? Are they, as you see it, the most important kind of cultural issues related to the common good that we're facing right now? Or even out of those issues that you talk about in the book, is there one, even maybe more than the others, that kind of rises to an urgency level in your mind?
Well, the five issues that I have chapters on in the second half of the book are Christian nationalism, social justice, abortion, transgender ideology, and the sexual liberation of children. And I picked these issues because they are especially urgent, I think, for Christians to understand, given their destructiveness in society. And by the way, when I say Christian nationalism, I'm talking about this being the view from mainstream media that, when you advocate for righteousness from a biblical perspective, that you're a dangerous Christian nationalist, that you're theocratic and oppressive and anti-democratic, all these things. So that's what I'm addressing with that, which is scaring Christians away from wanting to get involved. So that's the angle of that in the book. But I picked these issues because not only are they very pressing issues for the common good, but they are also the issues where we are hated. So again, the theme of the book is when culture hates you, what do you do? How do you, the subtitle, persevere for the common good as Christians in a hostile public square? So on all five of those issues, you're going to see a lot of hostility toward Christians who are advocating on those things. And so those are the ones that I wanted to really pull out and say, these are really important. They really matter for the common good. They're very urgent, yet you're going to be hated for advocating. So let's make sure we understand it correctly and know how to respond. And even within those five, I think that there's no issue that we can see as more important than the issue of abortion. I mean, these are literally lives that are being lost. In the other context, we're talking about the quality of lives, and that's really important. But when we're talking about abortion, we're talking about the deaths of millions of people. So I think that lots of issues. There are lots of issues for us to care about as Christians. It's hard to say, oh, well, I mean, more this than another, but I don't think that there's any plausible way of not saying that abortion has to take the top on that.
Well, good for you on that. Our organization, Apologetics Inc., Apologetics organization, has prioritized and placed an emphasis on the issue of abortion for the reasons that you're saying. And we've certainly taken heat for it. We've lost donors for it. And it's just like the misunderstanding of a biblical worldview. Like as soon as we started to, we created some videos on abortion and in particular, some of the amendments that were going around.
Those were amazing videos. I shared those on social media. I love that you guys did that. Praise the Lord.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for that. And they made a difference, in particular in Florida. It was a narrow vote, and I'm not making claim that we're the ones that tipped it in one way or the other. It was a collective effort, but there were a lot of people that this is the response we always get. I had no idea. I had no idea. I had no idea. At Summit, where I know we're both, we do work, and our friend Scott Klusendorf does work. Whenever a pro-life message is given there by Scott or maybe Megan, one of our speakers, kids always say, I've never heard this before. I've never heard this before. And so, we think it's important from a worldview standpoint to engage these issues, because what's more fundamental than what does it mean to be human? And abortion is a downstream issue from an understanding of what it is to be human. So that's why we engage it. And as soon as we do, we had people like donors saying, hey, we have a lot of choices on who we can support, and we don't want to support a political activist organization. It's like, come on. I mean, I don't know what you mean. I think I know what you mean by political activist, but you really have an issue with us seeking to educate people on one of the most important issues of the time so that millions of little human beings made in the image of God are not killed unjustly. I think you got a wrong understanding of political activism at that point. Or if, anyways, I'm going to get so riled up, I'm going to lose any eloquence if I have any in my speech.
It's really hard. It's really hard to understand. One of the things that I talk about in the book is that whenever you hear an objection like that, try the slavery test. Put this phrase in front of the objection. Say, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because, and then fill in the blank. So in this case, Christians shouldn't have worked in slavery because we shouldn't support political activism. Would you say that today? No one would say that today, because now it's acceptable and it's expected that you're against slavery, that everyone knows that, yes, that was a horrible, objectively evil institution we needed to get rid of. We don't say, well, we shouldn't have been politically active at the time. Christians shouldn't have done that. It's very clear when you put it in that perspective, but yet people don't like the unpopular positions today, and they think they would need to stay out of that. But it makes their point really clear, and the lack of courage really clear when you frame it in terms of slavery. So I'd love to ask that person if they would agree with that statement about slavery. And if not, why not? And how is that different than advocating today for the lives of unborn babies?
Yeah, that's a good question. And learning how to ask good questions is a really good skill to have when it comes to the topic that we're talking about. Hey, last big question for you. And there's probably not enough time to answer this fully, but you and I both referencing the lack of discipleship taking place within the church. What would be some advice or tips you would give to parents, church leaders that are like, okay, I get it. Yeah, no, we're not training our people to think on this. How do they begin? And I know that's two different categories, like parents in the home and church leaders in the church, but there's an obvious overlap there between all of this. So what does discipleship look like on this issue, or even more broadly, what tips would you have for the church to be more active in discipling?
Well, it has to start with people who, number one, are aware that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and number two, who are equipped to address it. So those are two, my background's in marketing, so I just kind of think of breaking things down in that way. But I think it makes a lot of sense here that we have an awareness issue where some pastors and some parents, they don't even realize that this is something that they need to be discipling young people on. And then you have a second layer issue of, well, I'm aware, but I don't know how to do the equipping because I'm not equipped myself. And so those are two different issues that we have to handle. And I think a lot of times what we're as apologists, we're concerned with equipping people. And of course, people have to be equipped, but we've forgotten that first layer of getting people first aware and interested in the issue. And so those things come first. Awareness and then interest lead to desire to actually get equipped. And so I think that, like I said earlier, it comes from the top down or the bottom up in most churches in terms of how these things come in. And I think that for people who are listening to this, who are aware of the issues and they either are equipped or want to get equipped, like you're a key pillar of this. You're a key person who can come into the church and maybe request a meeting with the pastor, maybe sit down with the pastor and, be gracious. Don't go in there. Like it's a very tough job, as you can speak to better than I can. But go in and just say, hey, I've really had a passion increasingly for these topics of significance and advocating for the common good and for what is right in society. And I know we haven't really had many sermons about this kind of topic. And I'm just curious if that's a conscious decision, if that's something that you would consider in the future, because I would love to hear more from you. And just ask that question and see where your pastor is coming from. It just might be that hasn't had the time, or he hasn't known exactly how to approach it. And maybe you can be helpful in that. Or maybe he says, hey, would you like to lead a study in the church? Great, then go do that, right? But maybe just within your church setting, talk to the pastor first, see where he is, and then see what you can do. And even if the pastor is kind of like, oh, I don't necessarily want to touch that. Well, that's a whole conversation, a separate conversation about whether or not that's the right church, to be in. I don't necessarily think that's an automatic I need to leave. But even within that, a lot of times pastors will say, that's not something I'm going to address. But if you want to lead a class or do a book study, I'd support you. So maybe you can still do something in your church. And then when it comes to parents, just to quickly touch on that one, I think that parents, you can't give your kids what you don't already know. So if you're listening to this saying, this is important, I need to do more, then get equipped on these individual issues. Learn about them so that you can then equip your kid, because you can't equip them until you actually understand some of these things. And it doesn't have to be something super overwhelming. You start with one issue. You're like, I need to learn more about advocating for life. The Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf is an amazing book. Go pick that up, learn about it, and then take the time to talk about it with your kids. So don't be overwhelmed. Pick an issue, start with that issue, talk to your kids about it, and don't be afraid to put it in front of them. The world's going to be putting it in front of them, which we talked about a little bit earlier. You have every incentive to get talking about these things. And Mike, you had some really great tips for that earlier today. I would just add, with teenagers, one way that's especially effective is to bring examples to them. So I follow on social media all kinds of accounts of people I completely disagree with on things, so that I can pull down examples and then, send it in a group chat. Our family has a group chat, for example, and it's like, hey, here's an example of this or that. So show them what the world is saying and help them see, like, this is the stuff you see in the wild. This is not just mom and dad saying, oh, we need to understand this from a biblical perspective. Mom and dad are saying this, but we're also showing you what the world is saying. So give your kids lots of good examples so that they get practice. It's training for
Yeah.
understanding how deceptive the world is going to be on these issues, so that they're not deceived themselves.
I think that's pretty helpful there. Grow in knowledge, pick an issue, topic at a time. You don't have to feel overwhelmed by this. Find a good resource, a helpful resource on it. And then trying to influence others to do the same. And you can do that with your pastor by gently asking these kinds of questions. Because I'll tell you, and a lot of times you're like, well, who am I? It's not going to be heard. Yeah, maybe, but what if 10 of you were saying this? What if 20 of you? There becomes a tipping point where pastors are like, okay, I'm hearing this from a lot of people now. And you'd be surprised at how many people could actually tip something in a pastor's mind of like, okay, I got to stop what I'm doing to address this or change. It doesn't have to be that many people, actually. Be careful about the way you do it, right? If you're just the obnoxious, arrogant pest, and then all your buddies are, you're going to be easily dismissed. But if you are gentle, compassionate, loving, and the pastor can see in you, man, you're just burdened by this for the good of other people. This isn't just your hobby horse, your new thing of the week. And then he hears that from another family and then another family. You'd be surprised at just what 3 pleas would do for a pastor. Slightly different context, but we saw this happen in particular in Florida. There were a number of, and I'm going to call them all out by name right here. There were a number of pastors that wouldn't touch a topic like abortion. You know why they did this time? There was a moral tipping point where they felt like, if I'm not doing this, enough people are going to go, why aren't you doing this? And it was a bottom up thing. It was not just influential pastor Y seeing influential pastor X doing it. So he's like, well, if he's doing it, I should do it. It was also bottom up from the congregation, where a lot of people were starting to talk about things like Amendment 4 and then just asking the question, why? So why aren't we touching this? Why aren't we helping our people think about it? And those voices are meaningful. And so if you're listening to a podcast like this, you're like, yeah, my church really needs to be engaging in this. Well, first, okay, are you engaging this? Are you growing in knowledge? And are you being faithful with your family? And if so, now go raise your hand to the pastor. Be like, excuse me, or take them out to lunch, have a meeting, and just gently ask, why aren't we? How could we? And to whatever end you think you can help, offer that help. I think that's good advice, Natasha. I think that's pretty helpful for people moving forward. Well, hey, I know our time's coming to a close here. And again, your writings over the years and your books and blogs have been very helpful. They're very clear. And so anybody listening needs to grab your most recent book, When Culture Hates You. Not us, hates you, right? Yeah, When Culture Hates You.
Yes, When Culture Hates You.
It's right here on my desk in front of my face, and I still hesitated. Very good, very helpful book. Last two questions, and these aren't long, so don't think like, oh crap, I'm going to be here for another 20 more minutes. I'm stealing something from Stephen Bartlett, who's the CEO of A Diary, guys. Interesting podcast. And he did this to end his podcast. Like, that is so fun. I'm just going to straight up steal it. And if it goes terribly for me, I'll abandon it at some point. But he always asks a guest to ask a question for the next guest. Of course, they don't know who the next guest is. So I had Greg Cash on. Do you know Greg? Probably.
Yeah.
He does video work. So I had Greg on, and I started it with him. So he was the first one. And so the question that Greg asks the future guest, which he had no idea was going to be you, is just this. What would you say is the story that God is telling? If you buy into this notion that God has revealed his will in some kind of narrative sense, like the Bible is some kind of narrative, not just randomized facts, if you will. What is the story that God has been telling?
Through the Bible, or what we're seeing today in society?
Yeah, through the Bible. What is the story that God has been telling?
Well, ultimately, the Bible is a story of reality, as Greg Koukl says in his book. It's a story of reality. This is what's true about the world that you need to know, and it's who God is. I always use this phrasing because I think that this summarizes it. It's who God is and who we are, what our relationship is, what's required of us, and what God has done for us. And I think ultimately that is the story that's being told, because those are the answers to the most fundamental questions of life. That's what forms your worldview. And the Bible doesn't tell us everything that we would want to know, but it tells us everything that we need to know. And I know sometimes that we'd like to know more. There are plenty of things. I'm a very type A person. I would love to know a lot more, but God has given us sufficient knowledge for what we need about those major questions of life. So I think that's the story he's telling us, the story of reality. I think I just plugged Greg Koukl's book without intending to. That's the name of literally the name of his book, The Story of Reality. You know what? And Greg has worked with Stand to Reason. And so maybe he's just setting that up because he wants
setting that up. This is providential. Well, and if you don't like that question, you can give Greg a hard time. But now you get to ask a question for the next guest to answer, and you can be as mean as you want by thinking of the hardest question ever, or a softball, or what question would you have for the next guest?
Well, okay. Well, maybe bouncing off of that answer that I just gave, what is the one thing that God didn't directly tell us in the Bible that you wish he had?
Great question. That's going to be fun to ask the next guest. So, all right,
these are going to get harder and harder. Yeah, as each guest comes on, it's going to get harder and harder until the final episode is just a long answer, an hour-long answer to the question that the person before gave.
That has built over the year. Yes. Oh, that's funny. Hey, Natasha, really good seeing you. I hope to see you in person before long. Thank you for your work and for how the Lord's using you to bring clarity to so many important issues. So anyhow, thanks for today, and God bless you. Till next time.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking with you.